The Manuals of Early Christian History, edited by J. Estlin Carpenter, M.A. Christianity and the Roman Empire, by W. E. Addis, M.A. of Balliol College, Oxford. Published by the Sunday School Association, 1893. Prefatory note: the early history of Christianity cannot be uninteresting to those who wish to be counted among the disciples of Jesus. During the first 300 years of its existence, the tendencies which afterwards marked the great churches of Christendom began clearly to display themselves. And even within this short period, the complex movement to which we give the name of Christianity may be treated from several different points of view. It may be regarded as the manifestation of a great moral and religious impulse, and the stress will then fall on its power of quickening the inner forces of character and transforming the whole standard of feeling and action. It may be conceived in its theological aspect as a doctrine concerning God, Christ and man, and the significance of its development will then lie in the successive forms through which the Christian faith was expressed, the circumstances which influenced them, and the intellectual and spiritual needs which they satisfied. Or again, it may be understood as embodied in the great institution known as the Church, through which the believer was admitted to the mystic fellowship of a divine life. Under this aspect, the history of Christianity is the history of its institutions and the ideas which animated them, its orders, its sacraments, its discipline to worship, its worship and usage. Along each of these lines, the cause of Christianity was affected at every step by the conditions amid which it had to make its way. The single phrase, the Roman Empire, sums up an immense number of elements: political, social, intellectual, moral, which immediately began to influence it. As soon as it travelled with the Apostle Paul beyond the limits of Syria and sought to address the Gentile as well as the Jew. It is the object of this book to describe those influences and to sketch their effect upon the general growth of the Church. Successive volumes would deal, as was hoped, with Christian morals, Christian doctrine and Christian institutions. It is not possible to discuss any intricate or so intricate a subject without assuming some knowledge on the part of the reader, but it is believed that a very elementary acquaintance with the familiar facts of general history will make this little work intelligible. For the sake of those who may desire some introduction to the early Christian writers, but may only have access to translations such as are contained in the Nicene Christian Library, the chief works are cited by their English titles. In the appendices, an attempt has been made to supply such information concerning the principal persons whose names appear in these pages as will enable the reader to refer them without difficulty to their proper date, locality and school of thought. J.E.C., February 1893. Table of contents. Table of contents continued. Christianity and the Roman Empire. Chapter 1. The Roman Empire. Early Christian writers thought, and very naturally, that the Roman Empire arose in the providence of God in order that the gospel might be preached to all nations. The apostles, says Origen, would have had much more difficulty in fulfilling this command if the nations had been subject to many masters and so had lived in mutual enmity and suspicion. And this is from Origen against Celsus 2:30. etc. The fact that the unity of many nations under the Roman government promoted the spread of Christianity is evident enough. Indeed, it is hard to see how Christianity could have won its signal victory over heathenism had the political situation been other than it was. There are, however, two other facts which seriously modify the view of the modern historian, and which Origen neither did nor could take into his reckoning. In the first place, the Roman Empire did not, of course, embrace the whole world, but only covered a small part of its extent. To this limited area, the Christian religion was almost exclusively confined during the first 3 centuries of its existence. This is what we're talking about, the Roman state form of Christianity. Even now, it is not the religion of the world. It is true that it was adopted by the Teutonic races and by some of the Celts and Slavs, who had never fallen under the discipline of Roman rule. But, with these exceptions, Christianity at this day is the religion professed by those who descend from the subjects of Imperial Rome. In the second place, the Roman Empire was by no means the passive recipient of Christianity. If, on the one hand, it accepted Christian ideas, on the other, Christianity, long before it became the religion of the empire, had incorporated the most important elements of the Greco-Roman civilization and was profoundly affected for good and for evil by the change. It was this transformed Christianity which took possession of the empire and which was imparted by Roman or Romanized missionaries to the Teutonic and Slavonic nations. Thus, the Roman Empire never died. It lived on. It lives still in the theology and institutions of the Catholic Church, which was its heir, its head, right? Or protege, or main. The Reformation of the 16th century was an attempt to discard these later accretions and to restore primitive Christianity. It was only among the northern races, which had never been subject to Rome, that this movement had any considerable success. Moreover, the reform was exceedingly imperfect, and the most radical of the Protestant churches retained much which was not Christian but Roman. Hence the importance of our subject. Apart from the Roman Empire, its political and social life, we necessarily fail to understand the history of Christianity. We must begin then by trying to see what that political and social life was. 1. The geographical limits of the empire. The territory of the empire as Augustus left it extended from the Euphrates on the east to the Atlantic on the west, from the deserts of Arabia and Africa on the south to the Rhine and Danube on the north. In the midst lay the great central basin of the Mediterranean Sea, and the Roman arms had subdued Asia Minor, Syria, Egypt, a narrow strip of coast along the southern side of the Mediterranean from Egypt to the Straits of Gibraltar, and north of the Mediterranean, the countries now known as Turkey in Europe, and Greece with Bulgaria, Serbia and Bosnia, Italy and the islands in the Mediterranean, Spain and Portugal, France and Belgium, Germany west of the Rhine, Switzerland and Austria south of the Danube. The space given measured something like 2,000 miles from north to south and 3,000 from east to west. It is supposed to have contained about 100 million inhabitants, and this is from So Herzberg and Reims Bibelwunderbuch, etc. Compared with the extent and population of the globe, these figures may well seem insignificant. The Russian dominion stretches further now than the Roman Empire did of old, and British India surpasses the Roman Empire in population. But such standards of comparison are quite inadequate. All the elements of human progress were found within the limits of the empire, and the civilizations of the Far East, those for example of India and China, are of little account when set side by side with that of Rome. To the subject of the Roman Empire, these distant lands were scarcely known. He had indeed good cause to remember the existence of the Parthian kingdom beyond the Euphrates, for the Parthians were formidable enemies of Rome, and so were the Persians, who rose to power on the ruins of the Parthian state in 22-6 AD. But the Parthians and Persians were semi-barbarous, and as for the rest of the world with which the Roman had any real acquaintance, it was either sunk in savagery or raised but one step above it. As yet, no one dreams of the future which was in store for the Teutonic tribes in northern Europe. The Roman was content to stem the current of barbarian invasion. The successors of Augustus Equus, in the advice which he had bequeathed them, and seldom made any serious attempt to widen the boundaries of the empire. To this general rule there were, however, two notable exceptions. During the first century after Christ, Britain so far north as the Tyne and the Solway became a Roman province. At the beginning of the 2nd century, Trajan added the great province of Dacia, a vast district some 1,300 miles in circumference to the north of the lower Danube. But the important point to remember is that the imagination of a Roman subject travelled little beyond the limits of the empire. To him, the empire and the world were practically identical. The world itself, so Tertullian wrote, lies before us. All is now open, all is known, all is occupied with trade. And that's from Tertullian on the Soul, page 30. 2. The unity of the empire. 1. This unity could not be permanently secured except by the absolute rule of one man. Not that political freedom and democracy were unknown in Greeks and Romans, or to Greeks and Romans. On the contrary, they had attained a very high degree of development among them. But the conception of representative government had not as yet arisen. Democracy was taken in the proper and literal sense. It meant a direct and immediate rule of the people. Questions of peace and war or of internal administration were decided by the public assembly of the people and not by a chamber of their representatives. Such a method of government was possible, so long as the state did not extend beyond a city and its adjacent district, though even then it could not perhaps have been realised, had it not been for the presence of slaves, who had of course no share in public life and left the free citizens a certain amount of leisure. But when the Roman Empire began to be, democracy was doomed. Where the Roman conquered, he settled. That's from Seneca, Consul and Helvetia 7. Consul and Helvetia. In other words, colonies of Roman citizens were distributed all over the known world. Added to this, that all free inhabitants of Italy had been admitted to the Roman franchise, so that a popular assembly could not include more than an insignificant fraction of those who were legally entitled to vote. It was not conceivable that Romans all over the world would leave the management of their affairs to the mob in the Roman city. Rule might be exercised by an oligarchy, by the members of wealthy families, or by men whose talents had brought them to the front. And for a long time this method was tried, but with disastrous results. The provinces were ruthlessly plundered by senators who turned their brief lease of power to the best advantage and made room for successors as unscrupulous as themselves. There was, besides, the danger of civil war between rival leaders eager for domination, a danger which again and again became a terrible reality. The end of all this was inevitable, though it was long in coming. One supreme head was necessary for the army, and the head of the army must be the head of the state. This change was finally accomplished in 31 BC, when Augustus became sole and absolute ruler of the Roman world. The new form of government was welcome to the world at large. However, much aristocratic dreamers might regret the disappearance of the Republic. The Republic had fallen by its own weight. 20 years of civil war had devastated the empire. and the new order brought peace and prosperity everywhere, but especially in the provinces. No serious attempt was ever made to revive the Republican Constitution. 2. In form, the Constitution was still maintained, and Augustus was much too wise to assume the hated title of king. His private life was that of an ordinary citizen, and his sovereignty was attained by the accumulation of old and legitimate officers in his single person. And his sovereignty was attained by the accumulation of old and legitimate officers in his single person, and by their renewal during his lifetime. But in reality, the emperor was absolute. Even the pretense of convoking the assembly of the Roman people ceased with the death of Augustus. The legislative power was transferred to the Senate, an assembly which under Augustus consisted of 500 or 600 persons, representing the aristocracy of wealth. Its powers were very great. Not only did it make laws, it also formed the final court of appeal in civil causes and in criminal causes likewise. If they were concerned with crimes dangerous to the public, well, when an emperor died, the Senate was supposed to choose his successor. Those provinces which did not need military protection from the barbarians, or were not like Egypt and Judea, especially impatient of Roman law, were committed to the care of the Senate and governed by proconsuls who were chosen annually by lot from the members of that body. In reality, however, the power of the Senate depended on the goodwill of the prince. He had power to revise the senatorial list, and constitutional freedom is impossible when the executive authority nominates the legislative body. The emperor was assisted by a sort of privy council consisting of some 20 members. Gradually, the theory of republican government was surrendered. Early in the 3rd century AD, the Praetorian troops, originally the emperor's bodyguards, had grown into a force of 50,000 men, superior in arms and appointments to any force that could be brought against him. The Praetorian prefect, from a simple captain in the guards, became the chief administrator of law and finance. Soldiers ceased to be recruited in Italy, and its inhabitants lost all fitness for war. Servile Orientals were promoted to the Senate. Orientals ascended the imperial throne. The emperor's power depended upon his success in pleasing the army, and it was hardly worthwhile to maintain the empty form of consulting the Senate. In these circumstances, we cannot wonder that an elaborate theory of despotism was constructed by the great jurists of the empire, by Papinian, Paulus, Ulpian. In reality, the old Roman empire may be said to have expired with Marcus Aurelius in 180. 3. Except among Jews and Egyptians, there was no real wish for the recovery of national life and independence. The Roman imperialism was felt to be a blessing because it ensured the priceless boon of public peace. In one respect, the subjects of Rome were better off than the present inhabitants of European countries. We see around us nations armed to the teeth and enduring heavy taxation to support immense armaments. Under the Roman Empire, no such necessity existed. The whole civilized world was one, and although there were masses of barbarians in unknown lands beyond the Rhine, the Danube and the Euphrates, these gave comparatively little trouble during the first 2.5 centuries. It is true that things changed for the worst under Decius, who in the year 251 fell in battle against the Goths, and his successors had to carry on the same desperate struggle which first exhausted and finally destroyed the fabric of the empire. Nevertheless, for nearly the whole of the period with which we have to deal, public peace was secured, and this by an army and navy which together did not number more than 450,000 men. On the other hand, the empire was again and again torn by civil war, which was almost inevitable, since the principle of hereditary rule was not recognized. Still, this want was to a considerable extent remedied by the principle of adoption. In this manner, the emperor, with more or less deference to public opinion, really nominated his successor. During the 2 centuries which elapsed between the accession of Augustus and the death of Commodus, there was little bloodshed in civil war, the chief exception being the 18 months which followed Nero's death. After Domitian's death in 96, the imperial power was held for nearly a century by a line of wise and benevolent rulers. It must be remembered too that bad men like Tiberius did little, if any, harm to the provinces. It was eminent persons in immediate contact with them who suffered from their tyranny. It was, of course, otherwise during the latter part of our period, when dangers from barbarians, and, as a consequence of this, the increased power of the army and the weight of taxation caused several severe social strains. 4. Further, the unity of the empire was consolidated by a magnificent system of law, the like of which the world had never seen before, and which is still a main factor in our modern civilization. It was a great thing to be a Roman citizen. It implied the right of making a will, of inheritance, of marriage protected by public sanction. It carried with it the privilege of appeal to the law courts, and raised the happy possessor of the franchise to a state in which his life and property were guarded from outrage and wrong. Often and in many lands had the mere words, "I am a Roman citizen," brought help and security among foreigners. Cicero in there 557. It opened the road to the highest honours in the state. The rights of Roman citizenship were extended by degrees, though it was not till the reign of Caracalla in the year 215 AD that all free inhabitants of the provinces became Roman citizens. But during the 2 preceding centuries, the rights of citizenship were within the reach of a very moderate ambition. They might be given as the reward of merit, they might be purchased, they belonged as of right to the magistrates of many provincial cities. It is probable that during the middle of the 2nd century, the larger part of the free populations possessed the full rights of citizenship. This counts for little if we regard the franchise from the modern point of view, and consider it as a share in the election of the governing body. The Roman citizen exercised no such right, but he had the inestimable advantage of trial by just laws. He had attained a state of dignity, self-independence, of which Orientals had never dreamed, while they lived under their own kings. Again, though the provincial cities had no voice in the administration of the empire, they had a large measure of freedom in the administration of their own affairs. It was not till the reign of Diocletian, towards the close of the 3rd century, that the provinces were oppressed by extreme centralization in government. We can well understand the tone of grateful respect which the New Testament and Christian writers of a later date maintained to the Roman rule. The Roman jurisprudence answered its purpose because it had been constructed by the genius of great lawyers to meet the necessities of a great empire, composed of many nationalities. It was based on the general principles found in all existing systems of law. Local and arbitrary elements were gradually eliminated, and the complicated system which had satisfied the wants of the early Romans, because it was endeared to them by use and want, but which would have been an intolerable burden. Foreigners was replaced